The first day of the Battle of Gettysburg during the American Civil War took place on July 1, 1863, and began as an engagement between isolated units of the Army of Northern Virginia under Confederate General Robert E. Lee and the Army of the Potomac under Union Maj.Gen.George G. It soon escalated into a major battle which culminated in the outnumbered and defeated Union forces retreating to the high ground south of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. The first-day battle proceeded in three phases as combatants continued to arrive at the battlefield. In the morning, two brigades of Confederate Maj.Gen. Henry Heth's division were delayed by dismounted Union cavalrymen under Brig. Gen. John Buford, as infantry reinforcements arrived under Maj.Gen. John F. Reynolds of the Union First Corps. The Confederate assaults down the Chambersburg Pike were repulsed, although Gen. Reynolds was killed. By early afternoon, the Union 11th Corps had arrived, and the Union position was in a semicircle from west to north of the town. The Confederate 2nd Corps under Lt. Gen. Richard S. Ewell began a massive assault from the north, with Maj.Gen. Robert E. Rhodes's division attacking from Oak Hill and Maj.Gen. Jubal A. Early's division attacking across the open fields north of town. The Union lines generally held under extremely heavy pressure, although the salient at Barlow's Knoll was overrun. The third phase of the battle came as Rhodes renewed his assault from the north and Heth returned with his entire division from the west, accompanied by the division of Maj.Gen. W. Dorsey Pender. Heavy fighting in Hubster's Woods and on Oak Ridge finally caused the Union line to collapse. Some of the Federals conducted a fighting withdrawal through the town, suffering heavy casualties and losing many prisoners. Others simply retreated. They took up good defensive positions on Cemetery Hill and waited for additional attacks. Despite discretionary orders from Robert E. Lee to take the heights, if practicable, Richard Ewell chose not to attack. Historians have debated ever since how the battle might have ended differently if he had found it practicable to do so. Background: military situation. Opposing forces. Union-Confederate morning. Defense by Buford's cavalry. On the morning of July 1, Union cavalry in the division of Brig. Gen. John Buford were awaiting the approach of Confederate infantry forces from the direction of Cashtown to the northwest. Confederate forces from the brigade of Brig. Gen. J. Johnston Pettigrew had briefly clashed with Union forces the day before but believed they were Pennsylvania militia of little consequence, not the regular Army cavalry that was screening the approach of the Army of the Potomac. General Buford realized the importance of the high ground directly to the south of Gettysburg. He knew that if the Confederates could gain control of the heights, Meade's army would have a hard time dislodging them. He decided to utilize three ridges west of Gettysburg: Hare Ridge, McPherson Ridge, and Seminary Ridge. These were appropriate terrain for a delaying action by his small division against superior Confederate infantry forces, meant to buy time awaiting the arrival of Union infantrymen who could occupy the strong defensive positions south of town: Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, and Culp's Hill. Early that morning, Reynolds, who was commanding the left wing of the Army of the Potomac, ordered his corps to march to Buford's location, with the 11th Corps to follow closely behind. Confederate Maj.Gen. Henry Heth's division, from Lt. Gen. A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps, advanced towards Gettysburg. Heth deployed no cavalry and led, unconventionally, with the artillery battalion of Major William J. Pegram. Two infantry brigades followed, commanded by Brig. Gens. James J. Archer and Joseph R. Davis, proceeding easterly in columns along the Chambersburg Pike. 3 miles west of town, about 7:30 a.m., Heth's two brigades met light resistance from cavalry vedettes and deployed into line. Eventually, they reached dismounted troopers from Col. William Gamble's cavalry brigade. The first shot of the battle was claimed to be fired by Lieutenant Marcellus E. Jones of the 8th Illinois Cavalry, fired at an unidentified man on a gray horse over a half-mile away. The act was merely symbolic. Buford's 2,748 troopers would soon be faced with 7,600 Confederate infantrymen, deploying from columns into line of battle. Gamble's men mounted determined resistance and delaying tactics from behind fence posts with rapid fire from the breech-loading carbines. It is a modern myth that they were armed with multi-shot repeating carbines. Nevertheless, they were able to fire 2 or 3 times faster than a muzzle-loaded carbine or rifle. Also, the breech-loading design meant that Union troops did not have to stand to reload and could disarm safely behind cover. This was a great advantage over the Confederates, who still had to stand to reload, thus providing an easier target. But this was so far a relatively bloodless affair. By 10:20 a.m., the Confederates had reached Hare Ridge and had pushed the Federal cavalrymen east to McPherson Ridge. When the vanguard of the 1st Corps finally arrived, the division of Maj.Gen. James S. Wadsworth, the troops were led personally by Gen. Reynolds, who conferred briefly with Buford and hurried back to bring more men forward. Davis vs. Cutler. The morning infantry fighting occurred on either side of the Chambersburg Pike, mostly on McPherson Ridge. To the north, an unfinished railroad bed opened 3 shallow cuts in the ridges. To the south, the dominant features were Willoughby Run and Herbst Woods. Brig.Gen. Lysander Cutler's Union Brigade opposed Davis's brigade. 3 of Cutler's regiments were north of the Pike, 2 to the south. To the left of Cutler, Brig.Gen. Solomon Meredith's Iron Brigade opposed Archer. General Reynolds directed both brigades into position and placed guns from the main battery of Captain James A. Hall where Calif's had stood earlier, while the general rode his horse along the east end of Herbst Woods, shouting, "Forward, men! Forward, for God's sake, and drive those fellows out of the woods." He fell from his horse, killed instantly by a bullet striking him behind the ear. Maj.Gen. Abner Doubleday assumed command of the 1st Corps. On the right of the Union line, 3 regiments of Cutler's brigade were fired on by Davis's brigade before they could get into position on the ridge. Davis's line overlapped the right of Cutler's, making the Union position untenable, and Wadsworth ordered Cutler's regiments back to Seminary Ridge. The commander of the 147th New York, Lt. Colonel Francis C. Miller, was shot before he could inform his troops of the withdrawal, and they remained to fight under heavy pressure until a second order came. In under 30 minutes, 45% of Gen. Cutler's 1,007 men became casualties, with the 147th losing 207 of its 380 officers and men. Some of Davis's victorious men turned toward the Union positions south of the railroad bed, while others drove east towards Seminary Ridge. This defocused the Confederate effort north of the Pike. Archer vs. Meredith south of the Pike. Archer's men were expecting an easy fight against dismounted cavalrymen and were astonished to recognize the black hardy hats worn by the men facing them through the woods. The famous Iron Brigade, formed from regiments in the western states of Indiana, Michigan, and Wisconsin, had a reputation as fierce, tenacious fighters. As the Confederates crossed Willoughby Run and climbed the slope into Herbst Woods, they were enveloped on the right by the longer Union line, the reverse of the situation north of the Pike. Brig.Gen. Archer was captured in the fighting, the first general officer in Robert E. Lee's army to suffer that fate. Archer was most likely positioned around the 14th Tennessee when he was captured by Private Patrick Maloney of Company G, 2nd Wisconsin, a brave, patriotic and fervent young Irishman. Archer resisted capture, but Maloney overpowered him. Maloney was killed later that day, but he received the Medal of Honor for his exploit. When Archer was taken to the rear, he encountered his former Army colleague Gen. Doubleday, who greeted him good-naturedly. "Good morning, Archer. How are you? I'm glad to see you." Archer replied, "Well, I'm not glad to see you by damn sight." Railroad cut at around 11 a.m. Doubleday sent his reserve regiment, the 6th Wisconsin, an Iron Brigade regiment, commanded by Lt. Colonel Rufus R. Dawes, north in the direction of Davis's disorganized brigade. The Wisconsin men paused at the fence along the pike and fired, which halted Davis's attack on Cutler's men and caused many of them to seek cover in the unfinished railroad cut. The 6th joined the 95th New York and the 84th New York, a demi-brigade, commanded by Col. E.B. Fowler, along the pike. The three regiments charged to the railroad cut, where Davis's men were seeking cover. The majority of the 600-foot cut was too deep to be an effective firing position, as deep as 15 feet. Making the situation more difficult was the absence of their overall commander, General Davis, whose location was unknown. The men of the three regiments nevertheless faced daunting fire as they charged toward the cut. The 6th Wisconsin's American flag went down at least 3 times during the charge. At one point Dawes took up the fallen flag before it was seized from him by a corporal of the color guard. As the Union line neared the Confederates, its flanks became folded back and it took on the appearance of an inverted V. When the Union men reached the railroad cut, vicious hand-to-hand and bayonet fighting broke out. They were able to pour enfilading fire from both ends of the cut, and many Confederates considered surrender. Colonel Dawes took the initiative by shouting, "Where is the colonel of this regiment?" Major John Blair of the 2nd Mississippi stood up and responded, "Who are you?" Dawes replied, "I command this regiment. Surrender or I will fire." Dawes later described what happened next. "The officer replied not a word, but promptly handed me his sword, and his men, who still held them, threw down their muskets. The coolness, self-possession, and discipline which held back our men from pouring a general volley saved 100 lives of the enemy, and as my mind goes back to the fearful excitement of the moment, I marvel at it." Despite this surrender, leaving Dawes standing awkwardly holding 7 swords, the fighting continued for minutes more and numerous Confederates were able to escape back to Hare Ridge. The 3 Union regiments lost 390 to 440 of 1,184 engaged, but they had blunted Davis's attack, prevented them from striking the rear of the Iron Brigade, and so overwhelmed the Confederate brigade that it was unable to participate significantly in combat for the rest of the day. The Confederate losses were about 500 killed and wounded and over 200 prisoners out of 1,707 engaged. Midday lull. By 11:30 a.m., the battlefield was temporarily quiet. On the Confederate side, Henry had faced an embarrassing situation. He had been under orders from General Lee to avoid a general engagement until the full Army of Northern Virginia had concentrated in the area. But his excursion to Gettysburg, ostensibly to find Sioux, was essentially a reconnaissance in force conducted by a full infantry division. This indeed had started a general engagement, and Heath was on the losing side so far. By 12:30 p.m., his remaining 2 brigades, under Brig. Gen. J. Johnston Pettigrew and Col. John M. Brockenbrough, had arrived on the scene, as had the division of Maj.Gen. Dorsey Pender, also from Hill's Corps. Hill's remaining division did not arrive until late in the day. Considerably more Confederate forces were on the way, however. 2 divisions of the 2nd Corps, commanded by Lt. Gen. Richard S. Ewell, were approaching Gettysburg from the north, from the towns of Carlisle and York. The 5 brigades of Maj.Gen. Robert E. Rhodes marched down the Carlisle Road but left it before reaching town to advance down the wooded crest of Oak Ridge, where they could link up with the left flank of Hill's corps. The 4 brigades under Maj.Gen. Jubal A. Early approached on the Harrisburg Road. Union cavalry outposts north of the town detected both movements. Ewell's remaining division did not arrive until late in the day. On the Union side, Doubleday reorganized his lines as more units of the 1st Corps arrived. First on hand was the Corps Artillery under Col. Charles S. Wainwright, followed by 2 brigades from Doubleday's division, now commanded by Brig. Gen. Thomas A. Rowley, which Doubleday placed on either end of his line. The 11th Corps arrived from the south before noon, moving up the Taneytown and Emmetsburg roads. Maj.Gen. Oliver Howard was surveying the area from the roof of the Farnstock Brothers dry goods store downtown at about 11:30 when he heard that Reynolds had been killed and that he was now in command of all Union forces on the field. He recalled, "My heart was heavy and the situation was grave indeed, but surely I did not hesitate a moment. God helping us, we will stay here till the army comes." I assumed the command of the field. Howard immediately sent messengers to summon reinforcements from the 3rd Corps and the 12th Corps. Howard's 1st 11th Corps Division to arrive under Maj.Gen. Carl Schurz was sent north to take a position on Oak Ridge and link up with the right of the 1st Corps. The division of Brig. Gen. Francis C. Barlow was placed on Schurz's right to support him. The 3rd Division to arrive, under Brig. Gen. Adolf von Steinwehr, was placed on Cemetery Hill along with 2 batteries of artillery to hold the hill as a rallying point if the Union troops could not hold their positions. This placement on the hill corresponded with orders sent earlier in the day to Howard by Reynolds just before he was killed. However, Rhodes beat Schurz to Oak Hill, so the 11th Corps Division was forced to take up positions in the broad plain north of the town, below and to the east of Oak Hill. They linked up with the 1st Corps Reserve Division of Brig. Gen. John C. Robinson, whose 2 brigades had been sent forward by Doubleday when he heard about Ewell's arrival. Howard's defensive line was not a particularly strong one in the north. He was soon outnumbered, and the terrain his men occupied in the north was poorly selected for defense. He held out some hope that reinforcements from Slocum's 12th Corps would arrive up the Baltimore Pike in time to make a difference.